Hey everyone, welcome back to Love Wins. We are doing something completely different today. Real life and time constraints caught up with me this week. And so I'm not ready yet to do the continuation of our society compared to Jewish society of Jesus' day, where they were, where we're headed. That's going to have to wait. Um, Kind of miraculously, though, I came across a way to do screen sharing where I can show you my screen and also be talking on the screen at the same time. So that's what you're seeing, and that's what we're doing. And a few years ago, I made this chart, couple of charts. I had no way to share them in this format, so they've been waiting. And so we're going to do it today. This is actually key and will help us very much as we move forward to understand where the Jews were, where society is heading today, where Christianity is heading today, because it really helps us understand ourselves, how we relate to ourselves, to God, and to each other. So, as a pastor, I do pre-marriage counseling for people who want to get married, and I use this program called Couple Connect. And in that, it's an amazing program. In that program, there's charts at the end that show you your personality layout, your family layout, whatever. One of the charts is about flexibility and inflexibility, and connectedness and disconnected. So let me just quickly explain what it means. So a flexible person, if you're on the extreme of flexible, you're like a doormat. You're like whatever you want, whatever you say, wherever you want to go, whatever you want to do, however you want to spend the money, I'm completely fine with it. Right? They just let people walk all over them. An inflexible person, completely the opposite. It has to be their way at all times, in all ways, etc. And you can see how a very toxic relationship can be formed by a flexible person and an inflexible person. And the inflexible person will just run over the flexible person. They will be in control at all times. And the other person's just along for the ride. They have no say. They have no personality. They have nothing. They're just there. Now, connected and disconnected. So if you're on the extreme of connected, which connected sounds good, right? So to our minds, flexible sounds better than inflexible, and connected sounds better than disconnected. But the truth is, an extreme is an extreme, and extremes are never good. So a person who's extreme connected is a person who cannot be alone, super needy, super, they can't do, they're super dependent. They have no sense of independence. They have no sense of their own person. They're we would just call them like super needy. A disconnected person's on the opposite end. They have no connection. So they're all in their own world. They're doing their own thing. They have often struggle with things like sympathy and empathy. They're their own little universe, and being in a relationship for them is near to impossible. So a few years ago, many years ago now, a couple came to me who'd been married for a while. They had kids, whatever, they're doing life. And they said they were really struggling in their marriage and they wanted to know if I could help them at all. So I sat down with them and I realized right away there were some major issues. So I figured I would get them to do this pre-marriage worksheet online. So they did, and when I looked at this chart for them, I was like, oh, now I understand why they're in the situation that they're in. And in the end, they never got the help that they needed, and they got divorced. The reason was they were down here in the bottom corner between disconnected and inflexible, which means they felt no connection towards each other. They had a hard time connecting with anyone, and they were both inflexible. So they both had to have their way, and they had no connection. Like, that's a disaster. Like, you can't exist as a couple in that scenario because there is no teamwork because you're inflexible. There's no teamwork because you're disconnected. Like, if you were inflexible but connected, you would value the connection and you would want to find a way to deal with the inflexibility. If you were flexible but disconnected, you'd be flexible to look for ways and for solutions. But when you're inflexible and disconnected, it's like you are completely apart and there's no room for wiggle. Like, it has to be my way. I don't see any other way. And so it ended. Now, I don't believe that it had to, because what could have happened in an ideal world, and even after 25 years of ministry, I still believe that good things can happen out of bad situations. In an ideal world, they both would have gone to counseling individually and would have discovered the weaknesses in their own characters and realized that it wasn't all the other person's fault, because when you're disconnected and inflexible, it's always the other person. Well, if they would just cooperate with me, if they would just see things like I see them, there wouldn't be a problem. So the reason I'm showing you this chart and telling you this story is because it leads into this chart, which is what I call a faith evaluation chart. This is where how we see the world through and relate to it with our faith. Okay, so here it is. So on one end of the chart is law of God. That's all the things that God says in the Bible that we should do and be, and how we should treat each other, etc. And on the other end, of opposite end of that, is law of desire. So this is, instead of following what God wants, I just follow what I want. At the top, you have realism. At the bottom, you have idealism, which are very much opposite of each other. So a realist is very pragmatic. They see the world as it is. Everything's concrete. It's black and white. This is the way. An idealist is, we call a dreamer, somebody who's not living in reality, somebody who sees rainbows and fairy tales, but they have no idea how to bring those fairy tales and rainbows into the real world. And all of us live somewhere on this chart, whether we recognize it or not, whether we ever thought about it or not. Our personality dictates that we live somewhere on this chart. So an atheist, for example, would be on this end of the extreme, law of desire, because they're humanists. They don't think God exists. Therefore, who I am and what I want and what I believe is the substance of my own morality. And you say, but there's atheists who are good people. Yeah, well, there's a reason for that. So an atheist could be an idealist. So they're like, I think the world should be this way, and I think I should be this way. And some of those desires that they have could be very much in harmony with what God wants. Some of them maybe not. But they don't think of it in reference to God, any of it. On the other end of the extreme is somebody who is very much aware of the law of God. And they could be an idealist or they could be a realist. So let's deal with realism and idealism first, because it takes the faith component kind of out of it for a second. And it gets really practical. So my dad had a shop for 35 years where he painted cars. So let's say you have an old car, been in your family for 2 or 3 generations, and you want to restore it. So if you're a pure idealist, you have a clear picture in your mind of what you want that car to look like, to sound like, what you want to do with it, what you want it to be. But if you're a pure idealist, you have no realistic concept of how to get from the mess that it is to this ideal dream that you have. Now, the realist, with no sense of idealism, would look at it and say, well, that's just a piece of junk. Like, forget about it. Or they would look at it and say, okay, I'm a realist. I know that people do restore cars. I know that it is possible for it to become much better than it is. But to do that would require enormous amounts of skill, money, and time. I don't have those things, therefore it cannot happen. So how would you ever harmonize those two? The idealist has all the dreams, but no connection to reality to see that, okay, for my dreams to become reality requires this. They need a realist to help them line up what needs to happen. The realist needs the dreamer, the idealist, to paint a picture of what can happen. So the dreamer has this beautiful vision that the realist will never have naturally. And the realist has the ability to connect the dots from where things stand now in reality to where we want reality to become. So the old piece of junk behind the barn to a beautiful car that you're proud to take to car shows, win trophies, whatever your dreams are. Now, to balance those two, to come into the center here, you need the idealist to not let go of the dream, but you need the realist to come and say, well, if it's going to happen, this is what's needed to make it happen. And if those two things can work together, come together, work together, then you're going to produce something. So what often happens for idealists is they start projects and don't finish them because they quickly realize they can't live up to the picture in their head and they just drop it. Or they don't even get started because they can't see how to get there, but they have to get there. And if they can't get there, then they don't even want to start. And the realist has the other issues that we've already discussed. So when they come together, they produce beautiful things. They can exist in this center where you have full engagement of both extremes in harmony. Let me say that again. You have full engagement of both extremes in harmony. We're not seeing that in our world today, in our society. We're seeing polarization. We're seeing people saying, this is the way, my way, and how I see it is the only way to see it, and anyone who sees it different is a threat to me and must be dealt with. Now you say we haven't got there yet, but we're headed there. Okay, now let's bring the law of God and law of desire into it. How could they ever be in harmony? So the law of God says you should be generous, you should share, you should serve, you should give. The law of desire, my heart says I want to have the most, I want to be the most successful, I want to have tons of money, I want to be better than. How could those two things ever coexist in any kind of harmony? Well, they can't in the human sense. They can't. A realist would say, not going to happen. An idealist would say, but it needs to happen. So the realist would say, okay, if it needs to happen, how is it going to happen? What is required in the real world, the realist would ask, to get these two sides together in the middle? The idealist says, I have no idea. I just know that it needs to happen. So the idealist won't let go of this idea, and the realist is constantly asking, yeah, but how? To get here is not something that is humanly possible. It's something God has to do. So if you study any character in the Bible, whether it's Abraham, whether it's Peter, doesn't matter. Those who followed God by faith ended up closer and closer to the middle as their lives unfolded. Why? Because God's promise is, if you follow me, what you desire and what I desire for you will come into harmony. In other words, the person who wants more, who wants to have and to get and to be successful, what they really want is joy, happiness, peace. They want to feel good. Everybody wants that. We just don't agree on how to get there. And God wants that for us. So as he changes our hearts, he helps us to see that, hey, the way, the realistic and idealistic way to be content and happy and joyful is actually to serve other people. So God changes the heart of the selfish person who thinks that they can achieve happiness and joy through selfishness. He changes their selfishness to generosity. And in so doing, they recognize that, hey, this generosity thing actually feels pretty good. And so God says he will change our hearts. He said, I can take a heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. So to get to the center requires a miracle that only God can do. You see, so what does realism and idealism have to do with this? Because an idealist will continually look at what God is asking and not let go of it. So this is where we need to be. This is God's ideal. And a realist says, yeah, okay, I see that, but I don't see how that it's possible.